three Wall Street firms, Blackstone, State Street, and Vanguard, that control assets of $20 trillion. They are the major stockholders in over 90% of the S&P 500 companies.
But wait. But when you're talking about Blackstone, for instance, and I happen to know about it because my son works there, they are investing the money of the teachers' funds.
It's incredible how deeply connected members of the media are to the financial sector, to the point where, in this case, you have Chris Wallace, the host of this CNN show, mentioning that his son works for Blackstone, a private equity firm, as a way of rebutting what Senator Bernie Sanders is saying. But Chris, that ain't the own you think it is. So I wanted to talk about that moment during this interview, Cenk. But before we do, why don't we go to a longer version of that to give you more context, and then we can discuss.
Over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. People on top doing phenomenally well, all right? Then you have concentration of ownership. You want to talk about oligarchy? You got three Wall Street firms, Blackstone, State Street, and Vanguard, that control assets of $20 trillion. They are the major stockholders in over 90% of the S&P 500 companies.
But wait. But when you're talking about Blackstone, for instance, and I happen to know about it because my son works there, they are investing the money of the teachers' funds, of public employees' funds. Those are real people who basically are getting their pensions.
But when I'm talking about, you asked me about oligarchy, I'm talking about power. If you have three Wall Street firms that combined are major stockholders at over 90% of the major corporations in America, determine who's on the board of directors, I think that is real power.
I just love that moment because Chris Wallace's, again, rebuttal to what Senator Sanders was saying there, Cenk, was, no, but my son works at Blackstone. And don't they manage the retirements of teachers or something? Don't you like teachers? Yeah. So isn't all that wealth accumulation a good thing?
Okay, I actually have an answer for how Bernie could have done even better in that reply, because what Chris Wallace said there really pissed me off on two fronts, which I'll explain in a second. But first I want to give credit to the people who had been warning us about this oligarchy the whole time. Let's watch.
I just can't believe that my face is on TV. Oligarchy, am I left or right? M-O-G-O-P. Oligarchy.
So now, kidding aside about James O'Keefe and his goofball song. Look, guys, I know it's funny. So he says, look, my son works there, by definition, it must be good people. No, it's, first of all, we don't care about your son.
No, we don't.
And that doesn't prove anything at all, zero. We don't even know your son. He might be a terrific person. He might be a real prick, we don't know, right? So I can't, he thinks, well, I got you, didn't I? No, you didn't. Okay, so number two, look, it isn't about any one individual that works at those companies. And by the way, have some people worked at Blackstone and other places and then turn into good guys and become progressives later? Yeah. No, a couple of people have, literally a couple of people. And Nomi Prince used to work at Goldman Sachs.
That's true, and I do be loving Nomi Prince.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that also doesn't mean anything. The question is, are they using their accumulated wealth and power to rig the rules of the system? And that is indisputable, they definitely are. They're saying, hey, for example, capital gains, we want to have it at 20%. For private equities, super important that they have this carried interest loophole where they claim that their salaries should be taxed at the same rate as the investments, which is 20%. That's outrageous. It's a total crime. Yeah. It's a long explanation of why that's a crime, but that is not at all investment money. It's an outrageous robbery of the American people. But on the other hand, Chris Wallace's son works there. Well, I didn't know your argument was that powerful, okay? But Bernie didn't push back on that stuff because he talks about the income inequality all the time and does a brilliant job with it. But I want him to connect it to how we got there. And we got there through the bribery of these politicians, through bankers like Chris Wallace's son, who by the way has a very high position. So he's probably in the decision making of sending those lobbyists to bribe the politicians to rig the rules on their behalf. And I haven't even gotten to the teachers' pensions yet.
They call him a decider, and he makes a lot of big ones and he makes a lot of little ones, just like George W. Bush did back in the day. But no, look, to me, what really stood out was how much media, like the news industry, journalism has devolved over the last several decades. Because even back when I was going to journalism school, that kind of conflict of interest, right, is not something to brag about, right? Like a journalist is not supposed to be like, well, you know, I have these close ties to Blackstone, you know, so I happen to know that private equity is fantastic. No, like a journalist would be ashamed of that back in the day, right? More importantly, someone wouldn't be hired for the kind of position Chris Wallace has, or wouldn't allow Chris Wallace to report on any story where that conflict of interest plays a role. But in this case, because of how much journalism has devolved, he's like bragging about it.
Yeah, and by the way, Chris Wallace is among the better journalists in America. I mean, so like it's a super low bar that he's clearing, and he's not clearing it. So, okay, now to the teachers' pensions. He makes it sound like, and this is exactly the problem with the conflict of interest that Anna's talking about. He's like, they're taking care of our teachers. Don't you want that, Bernie? No, they went to get those pensions because they're a piggy bank. They're trillions of dollars in money. And by the way, oftentimes those teachers' pensions, etc., way overpay those private equity guys.
In fees and things like that.
That's right, and David Strode has written about this as usual brilliantly on The Lever. So many other great progressive journalists have written about this, but it's a stone cold fact. And if you watched The Big Short or you read The Big Short, and that was about the 2008 collapse, you know that those bankers look at those pensions as the juiciest thing that they can go get their hands on, because they're gonna get those fees, etc. They're gonna collect tons of profits, and if things go under, they're gonna go, not my problem, man. And so, because there isn't as many sophisticated people on the other end of that transaction, it's usually government officials, and a lot of times it's government officials that they gave campaign contributions to. So there's no other party to protect you there in a lot of those circumstances. So that rapacious system that they set up in place that's gonna blow up on those pensions later, often does as it did in 2008, Chris Wallace painted as, we're taking care of the teachers. And yet this monster Bernie Sanders is still complaining about our beloved private equity rulers. No, they are actual oligarchs, and yes, they have just as much influence as they do in Russia. That was a point that they debated, because in our system, those oligarchs can just legally bribe the politicians. They just go, here's $10 million in campaign contributions. Now do exactly as I tell you. That's not at all different than the Russian system.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.